All right, well, good morning, everybody. Today we're at Bunche Beach, and we're in Fort Myers. And so Bunche Beach is a tidal wetland. And so this is an ecosystem that is heavily influenced by tide waters as well as rainfall. But if we look down at the water here today, I've been here in the past. We are at the canoe and kayak launch. There's a pretty high tide right now. So if we look at a tide table, we could see that we are at a high tide. At a low tide, if we look down here in the water, you can see the edge of the carpet down there. Typically the low tide is right around the bottom of that carpet. And so we're going to take a look at some mangroves today. We're going to look at a tidal flat, and we will see some examples of seagrasses today. And so just while we're stopped right here, again, I just want to point out, right, these are some red mangroves. And if we remember about our mangroves, right, the mangroves that typically grow closest to the coastline or the edge of the water are going to be our red mangroves. And so mostly what we're going to see on the edges today are red mangroves. And if we look inside, we'll see some examples of some black mangroves. One more thing, right, if you do come here and you go canoeing or kayaking, they also have a kayak rental place here. When you step on these carpets, this area of the carpet that's wet with water is actually pretty slippery. So I have students slip on this carpet all the time. So just be careful if you come and you step on this carpet. Okay, so as we've been paddling along, we've primarily have been seeing the red mangroves, but our tidal wetlands do have high spots and low spots inside of them. And so there is kind of a high spot right here along the edge. And again, with most things in Florida, a slight elevation change is actually going to make a huge difference in the species that will grow there. And so you remember the three common species of mangroves that grow here in Florida are the red mangrove, the black mangrove, and the white mangrove. And so again, along our shorelines, we have primarily been seeing our red mangroves, but we have this high spot right here, and we could actually see the nematophores popping up, right? So they look kind of like the skeleton fingers or the zombie fingers popping out of the ground. Those are the roots. They grow off of the cable roots of the black mangrove. So we have a slightly higher elevation area here, and we have some black mangroves. And if we go directly in front of us here, which we've got Kobe hanging onto the tree here, we have a white mangrove, and we could actually see the white mangrove propagules growing on this tree. And so nice example of an area, right? We've got our red mangroves here, we've got a white mangrove right here, and then we have some black mangroves in here. The other thing, while we're stopped here, let's actually take a look under the water, right? So the water is actually pretty clear right here, and we could actually see how these mangrove roots intertwine under the water. And so a mangrove habitat, right, underneath the water is just a big tangle of roots like this. And so again, this is great spawning habitat and habitat for juvenile fish, right? And so that's why our mangroves are actually so important. The other thing we could actually take a look at while we're here. So I don't know if you could quite see it in the video, but there are some holes in the ground, right? And so there are different species of crab that will actually burrow these holes in the ground. And one of the things that they do that we learned from our mangroves is the mangroves are continuously dropping the leaf litter year round, right? So we see all these leaves, and what these crabs are doing is they're actually burrowing down into this layer of detritus. And as they burrow down into the detritus, they're breaking down some of that detritus layer. But the other thing that their burrow does is it allows oxygen to get down into the lower layers of this detritus to, again, help further break this stuff down. Right, so in a lot of decaying wetland ecosystems, there's not a lot of oxygen below the surface, and so things like the drop roots from the red mangrove propagules that are diffusing oxygen into the soil, and crabs that are digging these burrows, right, are getting oxygen into the soil to, again, help break down this decaying layer of mangrove leaves. All right, so if we take a look at the Bunche Beach area right here, right, we've got this beach, and this beach is actually a really unique feature of this estuary. Most beaches are on our high energy shorelines where we have a lot of wave action. And so Bunche Beach is actually kind of unique because we're inside of an estuary, and most estuaries do not have beaches inside of them. Right, but what makes Bunche Beach unique, besides having this stretch of sand here, is it actually exists right between the opening of Fort Myers Beach. So that island right out there is Fort Myers Beach. And then that opens up to the Gulf of Mexico right there. And then this next island that we see here, right, that's the bottom tip of Sanibel Island. So that's Lighthouse Beach. I don't know if you could see it in the video, but we can see the lighthouse right on the tip of that island out there. And so because we have such a large gap between Fort Myers Beach and the bottom of Sanibel Island, and it opens right up to the Gulf of Mexico, we do have wave action that comes inside of our estuary here. right? And these waves will carry sand deposits with them, and that sand ends up getting dumped onto Bunche Beach. So one of the unique things about Bunche Beach, though, is it's not exactly, it doesn't have the same shoreline profile as a lot of our beaches do. We don't have consistent wave action. It is a lot more calm here. And so outside of Bunche Beach is this area called a tidal flat. And so it's actually a pretty high tide right now. And so most of the tidal flat is underwater. But if you come out here during different times of the day, right, this entire area where we are standing is exposed to the air, right? And we're kind of in a low spot right here because I do have some seagrass underneath me that we're going to look at in a second. But this whole tidal flat is exposed to air. So on a really low tide, you could actually walk from the beach about a quarter mile in this direction, and you're not even going to get your feet wet. So a little bit of information about where we are, right? So we've got Bunche Beach behind us here. If you can see the bridge in the background in that direction, that's Matanzas Pass or Matanzas Bridge. So that's the bridge that takes you out to Fort Myers Beach. All right, that's Fort Myers Beach right there. So we're on the back side of it. We are in San Carlos Bay Estuary. That area directly in front of me opens right up to the Gulf of Mexico. That's Sanibel Island right there. Those are the Sanibel Causeway bridges in that direction. And again, back into the San Carlos Bay Estuary, right? So some of the really unique features is if we look at where the sand exists in this estuary, right? So we've got a little bit of sand in that direction, and most of the sand is behind me in this direction. But Bunche Beach lines up where we have sand pretty much between the opening of Fort Myers Beach and Sanibel Island. So that wave action does deposit all of the sand here. But we don't have the longshore currents that are carrying it away, and which kind of continuously dump sand here, and that gives it the tidal flat that we have here. The other thing I want to talk about in this area, right? So we put our boat in at the canoe and kayak launch, and right, there's actually a pretty strong current that comes in and out of this channel. And so if you were here on a field trip with me, what I would make you do as my students is we would walk along the beach here, and then on an incoming tide, we'd actually jump in the water there where those two kayaks are. And we would have the tide carry us all the way back to the canoe and kayak launch. So it's actually a pretty unique feature. It's actually like a natural lazy river is what I call it. And so I have my students bring like a life jacket or a fun noodle, something to float on. And on an incoming tide, that will carry us all the way back to the parking lot. If the tide's going out on that field trip, what we'll do is we'll actually jump in at the canoe and kayak launch, and the tide will carry us out to the beach, and then we'll talk about this beach stuff while we're out here. The next thing I want to take a quick look at while we're here is this seagrass here under the water. And so what we have here below me, this is actually shoalweed, and I'm gonna pull up just a little bit of it. And so it's actually got a lot of algae on it. But shoalweed is one of the 4 common species of seagrass that we have growing here in Florida. And so we'll look more at seagrass on our field trip. But shoalweed, its main adaptation is that it's actually very flimsy. And so you can see that I've got this piece of grass and it's not sticking up, it's actually just flopped over. And so during periods of low tide, right, seagrass can't really tolerate exposure to oxygen. Shoalweed can tolerate it a little bit, but its adaptation is that during low tide, instead of sticking straight up, it's actually a very flimsy piece of seagrass and it flops over. And so during low tide, it will just keep as much of the blade of grass in the water as possible instead of having that blade of grass sticking straight up out of the water. And so you can see in the water here, there's actually some fish swimming right around here in the seagrass. Seagrass is a very diverse underwater habitat, very similar to coral reefs. It's not as exciting looking as coral reefs, but there's definitely probably an equal amount of life in our seagrass beds, if you have a healthy seagrass bed, as if you had a healthy coral reef. One of the other things that seagrass does for us is it actually reduces wave energy on our shorelines. So in the event that we do have some wavy or windy weather inside of our estuaries, what the seagrass does is it will actually absorb some of that energy, right? Because a wave is essentially energy moving through water, right? And when energy encounters friction, some of that energy gets lost. And so the more seagrass we have, right, the more energy will be lost in that wave before it actually hits our shoreline, where it can cause issues with erosion. So having more and more seagrass inside of our estuaries is actually an important thing. This area here in front of us is kind of the Bunche Beach recreation area. So if you were to come to the beach and hang out here, this is kind of where a lot of people will go hang out on the beach. I actually really like this beach. It's not the best beach for like waves or for swimming, but if you just want to come hang out on the beach for a day and you want to avoid some crowds, I think this is actually a lot better of an area than Sanibel. Because there's less people here and it's actually a lot cheaper to park and to get here than it is to Sanibel. And if you do want to swim, you can actually see some people are kind of floating in the water because we do have a pretty high tide today. But again, if you're here on a low tide, you're going to have to kind of wade way out for the water to actually get much deeper than your ankles. If you head down the beach just a little bit, there's actually a lot less people, and we're actually going to go down to the end of this beach. And if you have a canoe or a kayak, it's actually a great place to stop and hang out. You can pretty much have your own private beach. There's almost nobody down at the end, and I'll show you where that is. All right, so I had mentioned that. All right, so that I had mentioned that if you come to the end of Bunche Beach, right? So this area down there is where all the people were. But if you make the time to walk down to the end of Bunche Beach, you could actually have your own private beach area. But the other thing that's actually really neat about this location is this area right here. This is actually a channel that's been dug out because there's some houses and stuff back there. But notice how the beach stops and the mangroves really begin further on, right? So there's beach, and then there's the channel that they dug out, but then the mangroves start. And so where those mangroves start there really lines up with the backside of Fort Myers Beach. And so because we're not getting as much wave action in here, right? This is kind of where the wave action stops. So there's the beach stops and their mangroves begin. So it's actually, you know, where we have this beach in the Bunche Beach area inside of the estuary really lines up with where Fort Myers Beach stops on this side. And if you head in the opposite direction, Bunche Beach will stop on the other end where Sanibel Island ends. And so I think that's a really really unique feature of what we have here at Bunche Beach, just because we have such a large gap opening up to the Gulf of Mexico here. All right, so we've paddled into this area that's more of a traditional estuary coastline as opposed to Bunche Beach. So we've not gone too far past Bunche Beach, but we don't line up with that big opening to the Gulf of Mexico anymore. And so this is what a natural estuary coastline would typically look like. And if we look down into the water, right, we could see some oysters growing on these drop roots from the red mangroves. And if we look down at the bottom, we could see the decaying red mangrove leaves here. And so these all turn into that detritus layer. One of the other important things about our coastal wetlands is if you have species like oysters, right, one of the things that these oysters do for us is they're actually natural water filters. And so a single oyster can filter about 40 or 50 gallons of water per day. And so any pollutants or toxics or harmful algae or bacteria that's in the water, those oysters will filter them out of the water, and they will actually collect inside the muscle tissue of the oyster. Very similar with clams. And so if you are going to eat clams and oysters, one of the things that's actually really important is that you're getting them from an area that has very good water quality. So the area here, right, it doesn't, the water actually looks pretty clean here, but you know what we have behind us here in Fort Myers is, right, a lot of runoff. So we don't know what's in this runoff, but it's all getting filtered by these oysters. And so if you were to eat these, you may actually get sick because of the things that they're filtering out of the water. So again, just to kind of quick look where we are, right, we could see that Fort Myers Beach ends right there. The Gulf of Mexico starts right there. And because we're kind of hidden behind Fort Myers Beach now, right, this is what the inside of our estuary looks like. So in the distance there, we could actually see some of the black mangrove nematophores coming up. And if you kind of can see in the distance behind us, right, there's a slightly higher elevation behind us. And so probably why some of those black mangroves are growing here in this spot. All right, so we're back. We had to take a brief intermission to let the camera cool down. But what we did is we actually paddled down that man-made canal, and there's some houses and things behind us. But what we're actually going to do now is we're going to paddle through a mangrove tunnel. So if you're on your way back here, you actually want to check this out on your own, just talk to the guys that rent the kayaks at Bunche Beach. They'll actually give you a little map, even if you don't rent from them. Just ask them about it. They'll either give you one, or they've got them on a postcard, or let you take a picture with your cell phone. But it's actually really cool, and if you're trying to find it, there is a little orange ribbon on the tree here. And so we're going to head through here, so I'm going to pass the camera back up to Kobe. And you know, when I paddle through here, I don't like to talk through here. I think it's actually just kind of a unique experience to get to paddle through an area like this. So it's definitely not a secret here in Florida, but not a lot of people know about it. So you'll get up close and personal with a lot of the mangroves. And one thing I always tell people as we paddle through here is if you see something that looks like giant spiders climbing in the trees, they're actually not spiders. They're actually small crabs. They look kind of like spiders, but they aren't crabs. And if you happen to crash into a mangrove and one falls into your boat, they're absolutely not going to hurt you at all. So don't freak out if you think there's giant spiders around us. So. All right, so we've made our way through the mangrove tunnel. So if you're coming at it from the other entrance, you can see there's a red flag there. And if we just take a quick look and we look at the water here, so we are pretty far into the tidal wetlands at this point. And so this water doesn't get a lot of tidal exchange, and most of the rainwater sort of collects in this area. So the only way for water in this area to actually go out is through that tunnel or through this loop that we're going to make our way back to the parking lot. And so this water here is a little bit more stagnant, but you can see it's got that iced tea sort of color to it. And so that means there's a lot of tannins in this water. And again, so we've had a lot of rainfall lately, so we're in late June right now. And so we've got a lot of freshwater runoff from the rainfall in this area. And so basically what we're gonna do is we're just gonna loop around here. We're kind of on the back side of Bunche Beach right now. So Bunche Beach is in that direction. And so we're just gonna loop around. We're gonna go under the road. We'll be behind the parking lot, and we'll make our way back to the boat launch in the next couple of minutes here. All right, so we've made our way back, and so we're back at our kayak launch here. And so a couple of things about our tidal wetlands before we conclude for the day. So tidal wetlands and estuaries, one of the number one things that really kind of defines this ecosystem is constant change. All right, so if you think about it, throughout the seasons and throughout the day, right, you have changes in water level, changes in salinity level, right, between freshwater and brackish water and salt water. And you have changes in oxygen levels, changes in temperature levels. And you even have changes in wildlife, right? So sometimes in the summer months when you have a big drop in the salinity from the excess rainfall here, it's not uncommon to see an alligator in this area, right? But in the winter months when we don't have a lot of rainfall, it's also not uncommon for, saltwater creatures to come all the way back up here. And so a lot of the species that live in these ecosystems, right, not only are adapted to that change, but also depend and thrive on those changes. So that's it for our Bunche Beach, tidal wetlands, and estuaries. So today we're at Bunche Beach, and we're also at San Carlos Bay Estuary. And so I hope you guys enjoyed the trip, and I hope you learned something. And so thanks for coming along with us today.